Welcome to the Flyers Nitty Gritty Podcast, getting gritty with it with your hosts, Yariv Wallach. Jamie Baskow, unfortunately, is not here for this one, but we miss and love him. He will be back for the next. Today, we have an awesome special guest. We have Alex Appleyard, if you're not familiar. He's been on Twitter for a while. He writes for The Athletic. I've been following him for a long time, and I'm a big fan of his opinions, and I think that you guys should be as well if you haven't heard of him yet. Alex, welcome to the podcast, man. Introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me on, Yariv. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm Alex Appleyard, write for The Athletic among some other outlets. Been a big Flyers fan since I was probably, 6 years old. It sounds strange probably for guys in Philadelphia and like the surrounding area when there's a Northern English guy who was a big Flyers fan. But yeah, Eric Lindros, saw him on television when I was a kid and fell in love with his game and the Flyers as a result. So yeah, and it's now been, I think, around 23 years of following the Flyers, and probably the last 15 or so pretty heavily. So yeah, love talking everything Flyers. Nice.
What made you watch Eric Lindros? Like, what was that context?
Funnily enough, American football made me start watching watching Lindros. My dad played football to a decent level, like the British top league as a linebacker. Nothing special, like a special teamer and third string linebacker, but and all the American highlights from American football were packaged with basketball, with hockey, with baseball as well. So we watched like the American football highlights, and then the hockey highlights came on after. And I was never, I like football, but hockey was I just loved it instantly. And we, at the time in Manchester, we had the biggest arena in Europe for hockey, believe it or not, in England. It's very bizarre. 18,000 seats. We hardly ever filled it. So, I had a hockey rink with one of the best teams in England, and for 1 or 2 years, a good European team as well. So I went there maybe 10, 15 times a year and kind of fell in love with the atmosphere of hockey, and as well as watching the Flyers on TV. And it kind of, became my favorite sport, taking over from soccer quite quickly after that.
Yeah. And it's funny because, like, Eric, we were actually talking about Eric Lindros a little bit. We talked to Jim Jackson about him. He was one of those players that if you saw him play, he looked like something special. So that's why I asked that. It's like, did you watch Lindros and go, like, what is this? Like, who is this guy, Just dominating.
I think especially when I was a kid, when you're like 5 or 6 years old and you see such a dominant athlete, it was almost like a superhero in a sport. And there aren't many players, I think I saw at that age. I mean, I support Manchester City in soccer, and we didn't really have anyone close to that level at the time. So, Lindros was really one of the big appeals. I would have been a big hockey fan whatsoever, and I think the Flyers would have been in with a fair shout of being my favorite team, even without Lindros. But quite frankly, like, my dad supports all the Chicago teams, so if it wasn't for Lindros, maybe I'd be a Blackhawks fan.
Wow, that's actually really interesting, and because you think about it from an outsider's perspective, like, why do you want a Connor McDavid on your franchise? Why do you want a Sidney Crosby? Look, like, somebody like you, it's a great theory. If you didn't have Eric Lindros, would you have noticed the Flyers, just that little bit extra?
I mean, these jerseys were always my favorite jerseys, even when I was in my infancy as a Flyers fan.
That's the right answer, right? Yeah. I hear you, because, it's interesting, because I'm Israeli, right? But I grew up in the United States. My dad had some hockey background. I mean, he was born in Moldova, right? So there is hockey in Russia, and he had that influence. I didn't know any hockey at all whatsoever. I just focused on soccer. That was it. That's like the only thing I cared about. It's the only thing I played. And then my dad installed NHL 20 with Mike Modano on my computer. I played a couple times, and I was like, this is the greatest sport ever. That was it. That was like literally it. I started playing it in video games, and from then on out, street hockey, and it was like, you just see it, and you're like, oh, this works for me. If that makes any sense, like, this is my type of sport. Like, the speed, the tenacity, it had everything in it. So it's great. Love that story. So real quick, I do want to inform people about something. I like to talk about this site. We were talking about it a little bit off the channel, off the recording, but HF Boards, a lot of you might not really know what that is. If you're not, I highly recommend it. HF Boards is a remnant of hockey's future, and if you guys don't know, hockey's future is no longer around, but they used to be a scouting site that would provide insights on NHL prospects from all over the world, in all of the leagues, and they had really awesome breakdowns and scores, and they actually tried to do something very, very difficult and provide it for free. Which was really interesting. But since the boards have grown immensely, but years and years and years ago, I saw Alexander Appleyard on there, and in the Flyers message boards. And if you know those message boards, those are some of the most intelligent Flyers fans I've seen. I mean, if you guys aren't aware, there are some people who really know their stuff on there. It's awesome. And I remember just stumbling onto you. You're always one of those guys who, everybody always said, like, oh, read Appleyard stuff. Like, I remember this still, and this is like probably 10 years ago now. I just remember all of your posts were so well thought out, so well structured, and you always knew what you were talking about. I always appreciated that, and I just wanted to fill people in a little bit. If you guys don't know what HF Boards, definitely check it out. But do you still appreciate? I know that you still go on there, right? You still post and interact, right?
Yeah, on a really regular basis. Still not really found any hockey forums that I enjoy as much in terms of like the back and forth and finding out other interesting opinions from other people as well on a regular basis. I mean, I use Twitter a lot more now, but HF Boards, if it wasn't for Hockey's Future and HF Boards, I wouldn't be writing for The Athletic. I can guarantee you that. I actually went onto HF Boards first and foremost in the 2009-10 season because it looked like the Flyers, towards the end of the season, were making the run at the playoffs, and it was just, I don't know, kind of a weirdly exciting with having Pronger and Timonen. And being in the UK, at the time, I was in my first year of university in the UK, and I had a few friends who liked hockey, but one friend who was a Flyers fan. And I was like, had all this, my little brothers, my brother who's 4 years younger is a Minnesota Wild fan. So I couldn't really speak with him that much about the Flyers, and my dad, he's not an enormous hockey fan, but would support the Blackhawks if anyone. And my other two younger brothers are Flyers fans, but they're 10 and 14 years younger than me. So, at the time, 10 years ago, I think my brother, who's now 18 years old and a Flyers fan, was 8 years old, so he wasn't having much hockey conversation with me apart from very basic level. So, I wanted to speak a bit about hockey with other people who love the Flyers, so found the board, creeped actually for a few years before on there. I'd been reading it since about 2008, and during the Flyers just before the Cup run, I was like, well, I need to start posting on here. And from there, actually, it was how I started writing about hockey. Because when Along the Boards, a website from a few years ago, it's shut down now, they were recruiting writers, and one of the moderators, Hollywood Couturier on there, actually recommended me to write for Along the Boards. And I took the opportunity there, and then it developed to go on to kind of Sons of Penn and then The Athletic as well.
Right. Oh, that's so awesome. That's so cool. It comes full circle because I can tell you, HF Boards for me, humongously, impactful in my life too. And obviously, I'm running Flyers Nitty Gritty now. I can say the same thing. If I didn't stumble onto that board, I can't say I'd be here, right? Because this was back in a time where that back and forth, that really deep hockey knowledge, it wasn't so common. We didn't have the resource. We didn't have the Twitter that, like having today, what we have with all these prospect updates, it's incredible. You just have to dig, right? Everybody would pull everything together at HF Boards and then hunt. And today is just a little easier, right? But it's really nice to appreciate it. I just think it's funny, come full circle all these years. I see on these message boards, and now we're having a podcast conversation. You're writing for The Athletic, and I don't know, it's just cool how things come full circle like that.
Yeah, it really is.
Very, very cool. So let's get into the nitty gritty, as we like to say. I want to talk prospects, and the reason, obviously, not the only reason we brought you on, but one of the biggest reasons we brought you on, right, is your understanding of prospects. I mean, you have an edge on some people because of your time zone to some degree, but also your deep knowledge of the leagues, of the European leagues, the Swedish leagues, the Finnish league, the Russians, and I see you with some of the best insights on not just Flyers prospects, but prospects in general. But I think let's focus on Flyers prospects. We got some European guys, some guys in Sweden I think we could talk about, and I really want to hear your opinions overall on the team, but I want to go through a few players first. So first and foremost, we just had a huge signing. Linus Högberg, this was kind of a big name, and to a lot of people it might not be a big signing because he's kind of been in the European League for a little bit in the SHL. He's been having some really solid success over there, but it was kind of a question whether he was going to make his way over. Luckily, kind of here at the final hour, I believe Flyers just lost out on David Bernhardt as we speak, and that he's going to be a UFA, but Högberg was the one that we decided to keep. I believe, and I think the common consensus was that he had the higher ceiling and still has a really nice high ceiling. But what do you think about this signing? This was kind of a little surprise here at the end.
I'm really happy. I've followed Linus's career quite closely since he was drafted and really love his game. And what I think now came out with, Charlie's piece in The Athletic today is actually the Flyers kind of intended to sign him all along, and it'd kind of been a done-ish deal for probably a month or so. But it was just tying up kind of the nitty-gritty of the contract, making sure everything was in line. But yeah, I'm very happy he's signed. I actually spoke to his assistant coach at Vekwa Lakers today, Frederick Helgren, to talk about kind of how he thinks he will transfer over to the NHL and his skill set. And Frederick really had quite kind of good things to say about Linus. He says he's mature beyond his years, really good skater, transitions the puck well, calm under pressure, which are all things I've seen when I've watched him play. And in terms of making the NHL down the line, yeah, he's got to get a bit physically stronger and a bit tougher in the corners and those kind of things. And just keep improving his game, obviously, everywhere, because the NHL is such a high-level league. But he's definitely someone who I can see as a legitimate NHL player down the line. He's been one of the best young defensemen in the SAL for probably 3 or 4 years now, for his age group. And I think this year he was certainly one of the top 4 defensemen in the league under the age of 21, 22. So he's someone who I think really provides some good depth for the Flyers system. So I was very glad he signed, and yeah, best of luck to him. I think the Flyers have got a good prospect, though.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of us kind of anticipated that he had that NHL future. Do you see a certain role for him on the Phantoms this upcoming year? I know we have a bunch of young players kind of coming in. If you had to guess, and I know obviously you're not the coach, so we're not predicting the future here, but you have to guess what kind of role he would play for the Phantoms with the current makeup.
I mean, I think when you look at the younger players on the roster and the guys who are... Yegor Zamula is going to be the guy who everyone is watching on that roster next year. Yep. He's almost certainly going to start with the Phantoms. He was arguably one of the best 2 or 3 defensemen at the World Juniors this year, was fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
He's got all the skills to be... I wouldn't say the kind of level that Provorov or Sanheim are, but he's got the potential to be kind of the level that Myers is, or slightly better than Myers is right now, as a second-pairing defenseman with an upside as maybe even a number 2 defenseman down the line, 3 or 4 years or so with some good development. So I think Zamula is going to take the prime offensive minutes on that team. And then when you look at the other prospects, obviously Kalinuk hasn't committed to whether he's going to sign or not. He's going pro, but we don't know if he's going to be the Flyers or not. Apparently it's up in the air right now. There's a chance he will, a chance he won't. Yeah. And then they've got Wyatt Wiley. Wiley and Hugby, I think, will both play probably a kind of similar role. They have offensive skills. Both of them, make no doubt about it. They can pass a puck, they can shoot a puck. But when it's got to the higher level, their roles are going to be more defensive. And I think that's probably what's going to happen with the Phantoms. They're going to play... I think Hugby is going to play top 4 minutes, generally against the opposition's top 6 players, and look to have his defense developed even more in a North American game. He started this season in Vekwa on the first pairing at 5v5, playing against the best players in the SAL, which is arguably a slightly better league than the AHL. Obviously, players transfer over there at a different rate, but roughly it's a slightly better league and at worst the same level. So I think Hugby can immediately step in and be a top 4 defenseman on the Phantoms who plays the penalty kill, who chips in with some offense at 5v5, and who shuts down some of the opposition's best players. I think that's where he is right now. If he stepped into an AHL game tomorrow, he would be able to play a top 4 role comfortably in the AHL.
That's really interesting to hear, right? I mean, it's almost comparable to seeing a guy dominate in college hockey. Obviously we talk about Kalinuk, but even a guy like Mark Friedman, who, I mean, from what you're telling me, it sounds to me like maybe somebody like Högberg would play a similar role, because Friedman looks like he's about to kind of graduate right now, right? We have Högberg, we have Wiley, and I'm hoping that Högberg can be even a little bit better than Friedman, but I like Mark Friedman's game a lot. Is that kind of what you see? Do you see maybe that he starts maybe touching the NHL next year type of guy, like 22, 23, making it into, that next level? I know it's a little predictive, but...
It wouldn't shock me if Hugby got games in the NHL next year. Yeah. It wouldn't shock me if he got 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 games as an injury replacement, if he plays well in the AHL. I would be surprised if he made the roster full-time, just because he's not that far off, but his upside is probably a good number 5 defenseman, solid number 4 defenseman in a kind of more defensive role. He could probably chip in 20 points in the NHL while just being solid defensively, moving the puck up ice well. What I would say with him is if people are looking for kind of NHL comparables, he's kind of like, I don't like using the word poor man's, but I think it's necessary in this case. He's kind of a poor man's Stralman or Timonen, in the way that, he's not going to offensively blow the doors off. He's not super flashy in that regard. He has a good shot. He can pass well. He can skate really, really well. But he's not going to be Provorov or Sanheim in the offensive zone. He's going to take care of things in his own zone first and transition the puck up ice, and that's where his offensive value will be. So I think if he hits his upside, he could be a number 4 or 5 defenseman who gets 20 points, who's solid on a second penalty killing unit, and just a really solid depth player who fits the modern NHL. The modern NHL is so much about skating and blue line defense and being smart with your outlet passing to make sure you don't turn the puck over. And they're the things he really does well. They're the fundamentals of his game. He still needs to work on some things, but the fundamentals are there.
And that's kind of what I've seen of him. Most of my in-person view, or most of my, a lot of my views of a lot of these guys are from dev camp, seeing them in person. And I always got that feeling. I mean, the Flyers have a few guys around in that area, like Jack St. Ivany. These guys who can they move the puck well and they do things competently. I'm very interested in Högberg right now because I was worried that he was gone. And I love where you told me that it was kind of a deal in the making. And most deals are like that. In case of any of our listeners, we say this all the time. Deals do not happen overnight. Trades take a while. Contracts take a while. Like, all this stuff happens in the background. So I was worried that he was gone because I'm like, what is the numbers game here? You mentioned Zamula. You mentioned Högberg, Wiley, and then I don't think the Flyers are going to want Kalynuk to walk. So you assume they're going to want to bring him as well. As a numbers game, if you had to say, do you worry about somebody like Högberg when you have the other names to compete with? And, we'll talk about some other players too, but do you worry somebody like Högberg could get lost in the shuffle a little bit with all the talent? Or do you think he has maybe a little defining extra quality that can help him, if not make the Flyers, but maybe be a trade to where he plays an immediate spot in the NHL?
I would say the thing that impresses me most really with him is he's really, even when he was a teenager, I mean, he was a teenager when, I think he was still a teenager, when Vekwa won the SAL, when they won the Lamar Trophy a couple of years ago, and he was playing a top 4 role. And the thing that really marked him out on a nightly basis, he skates well. He's not the best skater in the world, but he's a plus skater in every aspect of his skating, backwards, forwards, laterally. With his calm under pressure, you'd have 210-pound, 6'3" SAL forwards who are 30 years old powering in on him up the wing, and he would just look over his shoulder, see the pressure, analyze the pressure, and either move the puck up the boards or skate out of pressure and deliver a really crisp outlet pass up ice. Obviously, everyone gets off the game at times, and he's had periods, especially in the last year, where he wasn't on his A game. But when he's on his A game, he's just such an efficient puck mover who doesn't put himself in trouble, and that's what I really like about his game.
And I think that's huge, and the fact that you're saying that, it proves why he is able to play against men, right? And I think that's a big defining quality, and people always look at skill, and skill is huge, right? Skill is what defines your potential, your ceiling, if you will. But if you cannot execute calmly, properly, and consistently on a regular basis, you're not playing pro hockey. Like, it's not happening. And you mentioned Igor Zamula, and I will say that was one of the most impressive things about Igor Zamula. When he came in to try out for camp, I am like, how old is this kid? I had no idea he was 18. He played in preseason. I never saw him blink. I never hesitated once, never clutched, never got caught in his own zone. And yeah, it's preseason, don't get me wrong, it's not regular season. But for an 18-year-old kid who looks as skinny as a stick, the poise was there. And if I think, that's what I look for first, is that if their brain can handle that next level of responsibility, I mean, that's huge. Because we see so many kids who have a lot of talent, but they can't put it together in those high-pressure situations. And if he has experience against men already, I think that gives him an edge against a lot of the other kids, to be honest with you. Even some of the college kids coming in.
Yeah, I think he's a guy who'll be able to jump in right away and just play a solid all-round game.
Yeah.
I don't think he's that far away. In terms of a full-time NHL role, if he really blew the doors off at next year's training camp in 2021-22, I think he could maybe make the team as as a bottom pairing defenseman right then. But I think in terms of the depth, I think it's just really essential that the Flyers have these depth pieces at forward and defense coming through, and they do have that because, like, for example, we saw how important Braun was this year. Just have a good third pairing defenseman. I mean, he started the season at number 4, but as it worked on and Myers got better, he moved down onto the bottom pairing, and it made such a big difference to have a defenseman who can skate well, doesn't cause too much trouble in his own zone, nothing flashy, but is just competent and can defend against one of the best players in the NHL without being abused on a nightly basis, like we've seen with some Flyers defensemen in the last few years, when you've got guys who probably aren't quite good enough to be in the NHL and are really good AHL players or solid AHL players who come up, even if they've got some talent. And it's a lot better to have guys in the pipeline like Friedman, like Hugby, like potentially Wyatt Wiley as well. I mean, I really like a few people do Mason Millman as well, who they drafted last year, because he has the same qualities. Just calm under pressure, good skater, great outlet passer. Just physically develop your game, and you're a competent NHL player. And I think it's good to have multiple options of those guys on entry-level contracts who cost less than $1 million, especially in a cap world.
Absolutely. I think you brought up great names there, and I think that is key. I do want to talk about Adam Yinning, okay? And this is a player, I want to transition to this because we haven't brought him up yet, in those lists of names, but he is a former second-round pick. He's a big kid. He has a lot of pro experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he did play with, oh my God, it's escaping me. Who was the first overall pick 2 years ago, the defenseman? Wow. Buffalo.
Dahlin,
oh my God. Thank you, Rasmus Dahlin. I believe he did some experience playing with him as well, if I remember correctly. Now, this is a kid, I've seen him in camp. He's real big, real strong. I know he's not the best skater, but he's a right-handed defenseman. What do you see with a guy like that? I mean, I see him similar to a Robert Haig type of player, right? He's going to be physical. He's got a little bit of that two-way upside, but really just focusing on maybe just getting the puck out of his zone, kind of keeping it simple, maybe a heavy shot from the point, kind of like Haig does. But really a guy that I think can mature into a really nice physical defenseman that you kind of end up taking in the second round. Maybe he's not going to be a top pairing guy. Maybe he'll be a middle pairing guy or just a bottom pairing guy. But it could be another Justin Braun type of guy like you were mentioning. What do you think about Yinning?
There are parts of his game I do like. He actually skates pretty well for his size, especially in terms of, if you compare him with Robert Haig. Robert Haig was a guy who was an enormous fan of it in his draft year, partially because he played for my favorite team in Sweden, Modo, so I watched a lot of him. And back then he had some real offensive upside. I don't think he's going to fill that, but he had some real offensive upside. But Yinning, I think, skates better than Haig. He is better laterally, and also his edge works a bit better at the same age, and he has a bit more power in his stride, which is a really nice fundamental to have. The areas that kind of worry me in terms of his development over the last few years is he has the skills. He has some skills. He's a solid passer. He's a good skater. The only thing I'm really concerned about right now is what level his hockey IQ is. I think that's the only thing that's going to stop him being a bottom pairing defenseman. I think he has the skill set to be it, and I'm not really worried about his skating or his physical game or his actual skill set. I think he's a solid outlet passer when he uses his outlet pass, and has some skill in the offensive zone as well. I think it's just to get to that next level. Next year is going to be a really big year for him. He's moved. Last year, he started the season at Linköping, who were kind of a mid to bottom table SAL team last year. And he started the season kind of penciled in a number 3-ish role. And by mid-season, he was loaned out to a second-tier team in Vita Hustons because he was getting pushed down the depth chart by guys who were younger than him and wasn't playing a confident game, wasn't playing that well. He went to Allsvenskan and was solid in a top pairing role there. And then Linköping let him go this summer. But he was picked up by Färjestad, who are one of the top teams in the SAL, have been for years. So they obviously believe in him and think he can kind of develop into something. So it'll be really interesting to see in a new system. I mean, he's been a Linköping guy his whole life. Before his loan to Vita Hastings, he'd never played for any other team. From the age of like 11 years old, he played for Linköping. So it'll be interesting to see how he adapts in a different team, different coaches, and if he can kind of round out his game. I think his decision-making at times is lacking, and his hockey IQ sometimes gets him caught out of place, but I think his fundamentals are completely there to be a good NHL player down the line. He just has to be more consistent.
Yeah, and you know what? Sounds like a kind of guy you would take maybe in the second or third round, right? Maybe he has all the skills, but hasn't put the game together. He never looked polished to me at Dev Camp. Like, he always looked like he could win the battles. Like you said, physically, he's pretty intimidating. He looks like a man. Like, already at 18, 19 years old, he's a really big kid. And I kind of see what you're talking about. I never saw the polish on the ice that was like, again, I don't want to gush over Cam York, but I am kind of a big fan of him. And that kid came in at like 18. And I'm like, he already looks like he's a pro, And I don't want to put them on the same level, but he just has a level of polish that I didn't see from Yinning. I saw Yinning as kind of, and maybe that is the hockey IQ, right? Just not knowing where to be and making decisions a little slower and, not being in the right position and making things look a little uglier, where a guy, like, for instance, like a guy like Chris Pronger, right? Maybe one of the smartest hockey minds to ever play for the Flyers. He was very slow. He was not a good skater. Like, as far as, like, speed, did you ever see him get beat? It's like it almost never happened. He's, like, he was 10 steps ahead of guys, and that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? It's, can you see the game ahead of the competition, at least enough to keep up with the game at that next level? And it sounds to me like maybe you were concerned with getting on that level, but we don't know, right? Because it's still early enough that maybe he puts it together, maybe he ends up with the Flyers 2 years from now or something like that. Doesn't seem like a come over to the AHL type of guy.
No, I think after this year, there might be a decision made on if to bring him over to the AHL. And I think, quite frankly, I think he could play in the AHL now and be okay.
Like today, right? Yeah.
Like today, as a number 5 defenseman or so in the AHL, I think he'd probably be as good as, say, I don't know, a guy like Prosser or Big Grass right now. You know, just a decent bottom pair in AHL defenseman. It's whether he can round out the areas of his game and be consistent and do the things that he does well all the time to be an NHL player. I mean, I think this is the thing that sometimes people do forget with prospects. If you're playing in a top European Pro League, you're a good hockey player with the skill to do special things at times. I mean, we saw it on the Flyers with guys like Jody Shelley and Tom Sestito and Jay Rosehill. Yeah. Every now and again, they just come out with a ridiculous play because you got to remember, these guys growing up were the best guys on that team until the age of 15, 16. The Jay Rosehill spinorama goal, you know, and you saw that with Adam Yinning at the World Juniors. He made 2 or 3 ridiculous plays against high-quality peers. It's just being able to make those decisions better coming out of his own zone. You know, you see it with kind of Robert Hegg right now in the NHL. Every now and again, he'll make a really, really nice play for a great goal. But that isn't the crux of what makes you a good NHL player. It's the consistency on a shift-to-shift basis. And that's really what you want to see improving with Yinning if he's going to contribute in the NHL. I don't think he'll contribute as more than, say, a number 5 defenseman, number 4 defenseman in a shutdown role if he really develops. But he has that kind of potential if he can just iron out the kinks in his game. He has the potential to move the puck. He's a decent passer. But too often he kind of fires it off the glass or goes for something that isn't going to materialize, or kind of gets caught in his own zone, or defers to his defensive partner when he shouldn't. If he irons those aspects out of his game, he could be a solid defenseman. It's just developing in the next year or two to be able to do that.
It's interesting, right? And it's probably his attitude moving forward. I will say something about Jamie, just to give Jamie a shout out here. He did interview him not too long ago. I can't remember. But he did say he was a very happy person, like seemed to take everything in stride. And I think that's kind of a big thing. I mean, we see that with somebody like Sam Morin, you know, because there's a lot of failure that comes with something like this, right? To try out, fail, get beat up by the coaches to some degree. You got to fix this, you got to fix that. I think that positive attitude might end up playing in his favor over time if he can really just keep that going, because maybe he is a long-term project, right? These big kids, these physical kids, once they put the game together, maybe he'll be 24 playing in the NHL and he'll be much better than we anticipate. And it's just really about just putting it all together because he has the physical tools, like you said.
I mean, I was more down on him 6 or 7 months ago, even though he was probably playing at a higher level then than before I spoke to him at the World Juniors, actually. Because I spoke about kind of development and skill sets, etc. And he seemed well aware that, you know, he needed to make better decisions with the puck and be better at the blue line, and that in modern hockey, you need to be a good skater who can outlet well and transition the puck from defense to offense, even if defense comes first. So, you know, it was kind of refreshing to actually speak to him and hear him, you know, say that himself. Yeah, I'm working on these things and I want to get better in these areas, and that's what I need to do. You know, which is, you know, the self-awareness to do that is nice. And obviously the coaches as well. People will be telling him that. It's just a matter of if he can put that into practice. It's not like he's not trying to do that. You know, it's...
Yeah. But to be honest with yourself, like the ability to be honest with yourself and even talk to people about it openly, I agree with you. It shows a level of maturity, and you don't get to that level. You don't get to the NHL without it. I mean, from what I know, you just don't. It doesn't happen. You have to be maybe the most talented player, and even then, like you said, it doesn't matter. These are all the most talented players. Like, they're always the most talented players. But I do want to keep going. So one guy. So I want to talk about 2 more players, and then we'll kind of move on. But 2 main guys I want to talk about. I want to talk about Ali Lishkill. I want you to give people an update, because I know that people forget about a lot of these prospects. I've only seen a little bit of him. What I've seen of him is he reminds me a little bit of that David Kasha. Smaller, skilled, talented, but maybe won't have the tools to be an NHL player because he's a little undersized. But that might not matter. So I'm really interested about Ali Lishkill, and then I want to go into Linus Sandin, and I want to talk the little bit older guy. But give me a Lishkill background here.
Ali Lishkill's a guy who I've really enjoyed watching from the day he stepped foot in the SEL. I would always say the benchmark for this is Oscar Lindblom. I'd watched Lindblom before he made the SAL for the Swedish junior teams, and he was a good player. But then in the first 5 or 6 games I saw for him in Brinas after his draft year, you're just like, well, the Flyers have got something potentially special here. Yeah. I didn't think he was going to end up kind of, a guy who's 60-point forward like he's looking like now, but I thought, oh, maybe this is a guy who's a second-line 40-point kind of player with a good two-way game because he just made such ridiculously good players on a regular basis. That's the benchmark. Lixell is not there. But I will say that Lixell, in the first few viewings I had of him in the SAL as an 18-year-old, you were just like, oh, this guy could be an NHLer it wouldn't be crazy for him to be a good third-line player. And he's just kind of proven that time over and time again to me since he was drafted. The thing I love most about him as a game is he's one of the most confident players I think you will ever watch. He just believes in himself completely, totally, no matter who he's against. He can come up against Swedish international defensemen, some guys who've had 15 years experience in the SAL, and he will try to dangle between their legs. He will try a crazy spin around and move on him. He will try to go past them, fake a shot, and go top corner, and it works. But he also doesn't... I do think the David Cachet comparison is actually quite apt, because like Cachet, he doesn't shirk his defensive zone responsibilities. I think he's maybe more intuitively defensive than Cachet. Okay. Cachet works really hard defensively, but at times struggles to pick up coverages. Lixell generally does a really good job in his own zone. And he just has a well-rounded skill set. I mean, he's more of a shooter, I would say, than a passer, but he can make some really nice passes. He's moved over to wing since he hit the senior league in Sweden, as opposed to a center like he was in the junior league. And he's not really so undersized anymore. He's still a bit underweight, but I think he's around 6 foot tall now.
Wow.
And doesn't look so small like he did when the Flyers had that picture of him being 13 years old when he was drafted.
and that's kind of that's really interesting what you said. I actually didn't know that about his defensive game, that it was that polished, because that's a huge thing. And I talk about this all the time, and I don't like to stereotype, but I do think there's a consistency with Swedish players and Finnish players where the two-way game is highly emphasized. I think it has to do a lot with the physical fitness as well, the mentality that they play the game, that both ends of the ice are kind of important. And hearing that about Lischko, that's actually pretty important, because, I mean, from what you're describing, I mean, because I like David Cachet. I think Cachet has an NHL upside as well. I mean, from what you're describing, it sounds like you're talking about a third-line player in the NHL here, and you're talking about a guy who, I mean, why wouldn't the Flyers bring him over? Maybe not this year, but maybe next year, of a guy who can, maybe make the team or at least be an NHL impact of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, this year I think he kind of flew under the radar, but had a really good season. Linköping were one of the worst teams in the SAL this year, and I think he suffered in point totals for that.
Of course.
He wasn't as good as Cachet at the same age. Cachet went from being a fourth liner in the Czech league where they didn't trust him to go into Mora and being the best player on one of the worst SAL teams. Lixell wasn't quite that level offensively, but he wasn't too far off when you actually look at kind of the 5v5 scoring rates he had. He was one of the best 5v5 scorers on his team, and he wasn't playing on the top line. He was playing third line minutes and was, I think, the fourth highest scoring guy on the team.
It's interesting, because that's also roles, right? And that's why it's so hard to look at numbers, right? Because it depends on the role in the team, the opportunities that they're getting, and who they have to play with or against, and what position the team you're in. So I like that. I like that you look past those numbers, because, I mean, in my mind, I'm looking for gems like that. And that's why I'm bringing these guys up to you, because I feel like people forget about these guys. We have a lot of these fancy picks, but every now and then everybody goes, where the did this guy come from? Well, he's been in the system for 5 years, and he's been brewing over in Europe, and you guys never heard of him. And I have a feeling that Lischko might be a guy like that, or it could be Yinning in the end, it could be Högberg, but there are these guys over there that are playing against men, and like you said, Lindblom was a perfect example. To us, we knew Lindblom was something at least mildly special, right? You could look at the numbers, you could look at what was happening, you could look at some of his highlights, but a lot of people are not going to expect anything from these guys that you're mentioning. The average Flyers fan really doesn't know much about them, and I don't blame them. There's not a ton of footage, not a ton of access, and we don't really talk about them that often. And I think it's really important for people to hear. They might hear about this guy in a year, right? He might show up at camp and just shock everybody, because it's not just the offensive game, right? It's if you can play that two-way game, you get yourself into the pros. You get yourself into the NHL. Or even a guy like Carson Twarynski. I interviewed him in the preseason, and what made him stick out to me is what he responded to when I asked him questions. What role do you think you are? He looked at me and smiled, and he said, he's like, I'm a grinder. And he's like, I'm a grinder. He knew he could have said, I want to be a third line goal scorer because I scored 40 goals in junior. He didn't say that. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he made the team. I don't think that's by accident. I think he knew where he was. He understood where he was as a player. And I think if Lishko understands where he is, and if he's good at D, I think that might help him jump a lot of these kids even that we might like and might know about. And if it's really that impressive, because I do kind of trust your opinion here. If you really think that his defensive game is even above Kasha, I mean, that actually gets me pretty excited. I'm not going to lie. This is a guy I could see top 6 AHL player when he comes over immediately, right?
Yeah, and next year is going to be an interesting measuring stick for him because unlike with Linköping, Färjestad are a very deep team. When you look at their forward group that they're going to have next year, they're probably going to have 6, 7 Swedish international forwards on that team. I mean, Sweden obviously are playing 20 or so, 22 forwards over the course of a year outside of the NHLers. But a good third of the Swedish kind of forward core is from Färjestad. He's going to play with really good players. You know, guys who potentially, a few of them have had NHL experience or at least AHL experience. He'll probably slot in a second line left wing, I would imagine. Maybe third line left wing, but I think he can win the second line left wing slot. And he's going to have an opportunity to kind of be on a power play with very good players on a high scoring team. And when you look at kind of SAL scoring rates, if Lycksell can hit 0.5, 0.6 point per game next year, that's basically an NHL player. There are very few players at that kind of age who don't make the NHL, at least for a season or two. You know, 100 games as a third, fourth liner when they reach that kind of level, especially if they're, like him, a pretty well-rounded game. In terms of his upside, I think he could be a good third-line winger at the NHL level. You know, kind of what Baker Bell was towards the end of last season. I mean, another player I really like, but that kind of depth role, chips in with some scoring, does some amazing skill every now and again because he is a skilled player on top of being solid defensively. And, you know, he's also a good skater. There aren't really many holes you can pick in his game. Just get a bit better, adapt to the NHL, adapt to the North American hockey, and you're looking at a guy who will be able to slot in. I don't know if he's going to be a guy who has, you know, 20 games as a fourth liner and they go, he doesn't quite work here, or if he's going to be a guy who has a 10-year career as a third liner. But that's the kind of level of player he is. I think he's a guy who, at his best, he will almost certainly be able to play in the NHL. Whether he does or not is kind of, you know, down to the next few years of development and what happens with the Flyers. But he's the kind of guy who, when he's 25, 26 years old, no matter if he's in Sweden or if he's in North America, he could hold his own in an NHL role. I think it would shock me if he didn't get to that kind of level.
So I'm going to pay more attention to him now because I actually wasn't aware about the two-way aspect of his game because I noticed that I typically pick up on the offensive game stuff really quickly because it's usually a skill set thing. You have to see a repeated pattern to understand if somebody's good defensively, if they're aware, right, if they put themselves in the right positions. I saw the offensive skill immediately, and I kind of assumed, they took a high player who maybe isn't very good at D. That's kind of what was my assumption, and that's why he dropped down because I saw some of the goal. I remember he had this one spinorama goal, which was like ridiculous, and I'm seeing even that. When I see a player who's young, 17, 18 years old, and he can score, let alone, I'm talking about 2 goals. If I see 2, 3 goals at 18 years old, you already have my attention. And that's pretty much where I was with him. So the fact that you're telling me he's got a defensive game that maybe, let's just say, parallel to the development path of Lindblom, I mean, you have my attention right now. Because those are my gem type of players. Like the guys who's got the offensive game and then, they can also play defense too. That means I can play them anywhere, and that makes him an NHL player to me.
I mean, he's not going to be Lindblom level defense.
I don't want to put that.
Yeah,
I don't want to put that on him. But if you're saying, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Defense in a similar way to someone I always really admired for his defensive game when he's in Philly, and I thought at times he kind of got overlooked for how solid he was defensively. Was Scott Hartnell? People talked about Scott Hartnell's net front presence and his shot, but kind of laughed at him for his skating and never thought much of his defensive game. But he was above average defensive winger in the NHL who always covered for the other winger in his centre. You know, he was the guy if Giroux was up ice when he was on the line. He was the guy dropping back and playing the centre position in the defensive zone and doing a solid job of that. He doesn't stand out defensively. He's not kind of a big showy. He's not Barkov taking pucks away left, right, and centre, or Datsuk or Couturier being physically imposing and matching out the opposition's best player in the centre spot. But he's the guy who, you play at left wing and he just quietly goes about his business defensively, is rarely out of position, doesn't do too much wrong, and doesn't cause too much fuss there and gets it to the offensive zone. So that's that's where he is. And obviously North America is different. There's a more physical game there. You've got less time on ice. You've got less space on ice. So that obviously plays into it. But in the SAL, in a good league, he's a solid defensive player right now against men. So
again, that interests me because that's how I see those Swedish leagues. I see them as they pay attention to detail of the two-way game, and that's important to me. So let's move on to the next one here. And so I want to talk about Linus Sandin. I don't know that much about him, to be honest with you. I've watched some footage of him. I've looked into his career. I haven't had a chance to really watch his games. I know about his brother. I know his brother has got a more polished career. But I did see, early career. Obviously, he's younger brother. But I did see those were really impressive numbers that he put up this past year. Doesn't mean that's an indication of a breakout year, but it means it could be a breakout year. And because I haven't seen him play, actually, I'm only making assumptions off numbers, which I don't like to do. So I would love to hear, what do you think about Linus Sandin? To me, he seems like another Ratful type of guy. You bring him in, probably capable of being a third-line player today, probably has a two-way game, probably can move all up and down the lineup, but maybe the Flyers won't rush to put him in the NHL immediately. Maybe let him kind of play in the AHL first before they send him to the NHL with the bigger, stronger boys. But it might not require that because, again, 19 goals, and I believe he led his team, or at least tied for his team in goals. That is very impressive as far as I'm concerned. Even at 22, 23 years old. Again, that's the way I view that league. If you're a goal scorer in a league that's hard to score goals, I think that's impressive. What do you think about Sandin?
He's an interesting player. The first time I saw Linus Sandin play, I don't even really remember him, really, because he was a fourth liner on an under-20 team, my favorite Swedish team, Modo. He was played on the same team as Heg. I'm not sure if they've played in a game together for the under-20 team, but they played in the same year. When I was kind of focusing on kind of Robert Heg being the standout young player for Modo, he was a kind of really late bloomer. I don't think anyone would have watched him at 18, 19 years old and thought this is an NHL player. But he left the Modo system, went to the Allsvenskan for a couple of years, worked his way up from a fourth liner in the Allsvenskan to a first liner in the Allsvenskan, was like a kind of pretty good goal scorer in the Allsvenskan, got himself a job in the SAL 3 years ago with Rögle, kind of, a mid to bottom tier SAL team. Started on their fourth line, played his whole first season with Rögle on the fourth line, and then last year kind of exploded for Rögle. I actually got to see him in person 2 or 3 times last year, because I was living in Copenhagen at the time, and Rögle is in Ängelholm, which is only around an hour and a half away from Copenhagen. So if Malmö weren't playing, who were only half an hour away from Copenhagen, sometimes I'd nip up to, watch an Ängelholm game, watch Rögle play. Sandin was the kind of guy who, he stood out. I'd kept some tabs on him because I like to keep tabs on a lot of Modo players because they're my favourite Swedish team.
Yeah.
But that year, he kind of just exploded offensively. He got a big role. He got a power play role halfway through the year. He'd been penalty killing the year before for them. And halfway through the year, Rögle kind of took him off the penalty kill because he was too important in other aspects to have him on the penalty kill. He was one of the top young scorers in the SAL and got a big deal. I moved over to HV71, one of the top teams in the SAL for last year. And he went there with even more talent on the roster and shone just the same. He matched his numbers effectively from a lower team with a better team. What really impresses me, if you're talking about numbers, is if you dive into the numbers with Linus Sandin, he's solid on the power play, but he does so much of his scoring at even strength. The last 2 years, he has the highest goals rate for anyone in the SAL at even strength. And it's the way he scores his goals as well. You see some players in European leagues, and you worry about how they're going to transfer to North America because of the way they score the goals. On bigger ice, sometimes weaker seams. You have sometimes areas where players are slower developing. You can shoot from maybe a bit further out and get an opportunity. But with Sandin, when you watch back his goals in the SAL so far, you'll have a hard time finding more than one or two that he scores from outside of 10 feet, 15 feet. The guy has a really good, nice wrist shot, but he sits in front of the crease, cleans up garbage, tips shots in. He's a physical player who, he's not going to go out and punch someone in the face and fight or anything, but in the same way that Raffle and Lindblom are physical, he'll tie guys up on the boards. He won't back down in a net front battle. He'll get position on big defensemen. That's a really nice aspect of his game, and he's also a solid defensive player as well. So yeah, he's got the kind of game where you think he could transition to North America pretty quickly and pretty effectively. I'm not sure if he'll start in the NHL or the AHL. I think it really depends on training camp next year.
Sure.
He probably has the potential, at worst, to be a solid NHL fourth liner right now. If his games, adapts straight away and potentially even be a third liner right now, But I think maybe he starts in the AHL like Raffle did, like Matt Reed did, and then within 5-10 games, people go, "There's no point in having him in the AHL right now. He's just too well-rounded and too mature because he can penalty kill. He's a solid power play player. He does a lot of his damage at 5v5. And one thing over the last few years in the SEL that I think's been interesting with him is he's become a better play driver. In his first year, he was okay. In his second year, he was solid. And this year, he was the guy who was driving play on his line. He was making good reads in the neutral zone. He was getting the puck in. He was chasing the puck. He was retrieving the puck. He was then getting around the net. His game isn't just as a scorer, even though it is. That's what he excels at. He excels at getting to weak spots on ice, picking up low coverages, and getting goals. But kind of like Raffle, Raffle's a well-rounded player who is a goal-first player.
Yep.
But he can make a decent pass from here to there, and I think that's the kind of ceiling that you'll see with Sandin. Maybe he has slightly better shot than Raffle, but I would imagine that he's the kind of guy who, if he really hits his ceiling, could fill in on a second line, but you really want him playing on a third line, and he'll be a physical net front presence on a third line. And I think that's kind of something that, if he hits and if he develops, and if he can transition to the NHL and bring that game that he's got in Sweden, could be really valuable to the Flyers' bottom six. If you've got him on one line and Nicholas Aubé-Kubel on another line, that's going to be a nightmare for opposition defensemen, because you've got guys who are physical, who can forecheck well, who can get to those seams and ice in the danger areas on every line on the team. And it's not pleasant to play against guys. You speak to professional defensemen, and they're the kind of guys who they hate. The guys who are always all over them, who they turn around and they're on the back, who buzz all up and down the ice. Guys like Raffle does it pretty well. Morgan Frost did it really well in his time in the NHL. Claude Giroux has always done it so well. And then Aubé-Kubel really stood out in that regard this year for the Flyers. And Farabee also did a solid job too. And I think the Flyers are building a team that can forecheck all day long and cause havoc for the opposition defenseman. If you can't get a clean pass out of the defensive zone, we've seen in the last few years when, you have guys like, no disrespect to him, he was a solid NHL player for a long time, but Andrew McDonald, you put pressure on him in the defensive zone, he's going to turn the puck over or have to fling it off the ice. You see it with Robert Hegg at times now.
Yep.
If you put pressure on him, he's going to ice the puck. And it's not because he's an awful hockey player, it's because that's not his skill set and he struggles under pressure.
It's a safe play for him, yeah.
And
no, I hear you. Keep going. Sorry.
If you have guys like that in the bottom six, and if Sandin can be that in the NHL, it's not guaranteed. I'm not saying he's going to step in and be a great third liner. There's a chance that he's okay in the AHL. He fills in the NHL as a solid fourth liner, and then after a year or two goes back to Sweden. But he certainly has the potential to be a really, really good third liner in the NHL.
That was a hell of a breakdown. That was perfect, and honestly, that gets me excited. It really does, and I get excited by players like that. Again, for the same reason I get excited at Lishko, when I see the value of somebody that I can put all over, somebody who can play physical, somebody who can be smart, not make mistakes, because it's a lot of what winning is. It's not making mistakes, and we can see that. You see the old Flyers teams of the past, the way we played now under AV, the way we played under Hackstall. There's a definite efficiency difference in the way the team operates, right? And I think that's huge. I love what you said about how he kind of picked up the offensive game later. That's really the development cycle you hope, where he has the physical tools and everything else. He just keeps growing. So maybe he is on that really awesome pace. But let me ask you this. I'm really excited about him now, and I hear this name, but then I hear other names, right? I know we have Tanner Lashinsky, right, who's the center, right? But we also have like Wade Allison. These guys are 22, 21 years old. They're not a lot younger than somebody like Sandin. Where do you see his role in comparison to guys like Allison? I mean, we'd have guys like Tyler Pitlick, who maybe is not back. Is he in that category, or is he that bottom six guy, or do you see a chance where like Allison will probably take his spot, and really the Flyers are more interested in that goal-scoring guy on the third line, that Sandin will fit more of that physical edge and maybe take over for Tyler Pitlick next year, where maybe we can't sign Pitlick?
I think what's nice about some of the Flyers prospects and younger players is they can probably do both. When you look at Sandin and Aubé-Kubel and Lashinsky and Allison, they're the kind of guys who, you hope they can fill in on a third line and be a goal scorer. And if they're not, their games are well-rounded enough and they have the physical attributes that they could be a Tyler Pitlick and chip in with some skill, but mainly play kind of an energy role on a fourth line, but still provide that skill. So I think it's just good to have so many of them kind of right now. It's a rarity for the Flyers to have that many young players who can potentially fill in the NHL. And I think you've seen in this cap era, it's became even more important. When you look at, quite frankly, the Penguins in the last few years, you look at every single time someone's gone down injured, they've just brought up a kid who no one's really heard of, who fits in on a third line. You go through the names and you're like Rust and Sheary and Gensel, and now you've got Ashton Reese and you've got Teddy Bluegers. Every single time they just pull in this guy out of the AHL who fits in straight away, might not be a world beater, but can play a solid role in the NHL, and then goes on to another NHL team where they're slightly higher up the lineup. And I think the Flyers have the potential to be that over the next 5 or 6 years, where, guys who might not get a look with the Flyers, a year later are playing a third line role for the Sabres, for the Oilers, for the Flames. It wouldn't surprise me at all, and I think that's a really good problem to have, because in this cap league, it's essential that you have these depth players coming through. And yeah, maybe they only play for you for 2 years, but it's so essential.
It's better than have to go out and either overpay for a player or to trade for a guy and lose a pick, right? I agree with you. It's the perfect problem to have. It's really what we need, and I agree that the Penguins are a great representation of that. And I think people think of depth as this thing where, you look at your starting lineup, and I have Crosby and Malkin as my 1-2 punch, and that's depth. But that's really not depth. The depth you see with the Penguins happens when one of them goes down, and they don't lose a game, and they don't miss a beat. They just keep going like a machine, right? People fill in those roles. I think it's a beautiful thing what you just said there, right? Because we have all these guys that maybe can fill those roles. Well, they're training in those roles too. You talk about those injuries that pop up. Well, great. So Sandin goes down. Well, maybe we throw Allison in. Maybe we throw in Nicholas Aube-Kubel. Maybe we throw in Twarynski. Maybe Bunnaman. We have all these guys that can fit in that bottom six. And the beautiful part is that we don't have to force them to be in that top six. And I think that's the scarier part, right? Where we had Michael Rothel, who I really like, and I've liked from day one. And you could argue did a really adequate job as a top line left winger. But I don't think we ever really want to see that again, where the Flyers don't have an option for a top left wing, and the only option is Michael Rothel. And if it is Sandin, that's great. But I'd rather have Lindblom, you know what I mean? A guy who can really put up goals, 25 goals a year, pretty much on a regular basis. But I hear you, man. That's an exciting time. Is there anybody else from the European leagues that you want to bring up that you think could be another one of those guys that maybe would surprise some people or that you're excited about in general?
I mean, I wouldn't say from the European League, but one guy I think who fills a very similar role, who is a Euro from the Phantoms, is Maxim Sushko. He's kind of in that same mold as an Aube-Kubel, as a Cachet, as a Lixell, as a Raffle, as a Sandin, a guy who he's skilled, he skates well, he looks after the defensive zone well. The moment that Sushko really started to stand out for me, I mean, I liked him when they drafted him. I thought he was a good pickup for a skilled guy. He was kind of down the depth chart on an OHL team and still putting up good points. But I got the pleasure of watching him at the World Championships in Copenhagen a couple of years ago. And 18 years old in the World Championships. He's playing like number 13 forward, number 12 forward for the Belarus side. And he went into a corner with Jon Klingberg, who's, probably one of the best 20 or so defensemen, 30 defensemen in the NHL, Dallas Stars. Great player. And he dropped his shoulder into Klingberg, skated laterally while protecting the puck, and made Klingberg fall to the ice. Good skating, made Klingberg lose his edges, and Klingberg's a fantastic skater. And in that moment I thought, well, I should probably even pay more attention to this kid because it's one play. But at the same time, to do that as an 18-year-old at the kind of highest level of hockey, outside the Olympics at the international level, it impressed me. And he just has a lot of similar attributes to those guys in his game. He's got a really nice shot. He's got a really good motor. He forechucks all day long. And he has some real skill. I mean, we saw that at the World Juniors where he almost single-handedly kept Belarus up that year. And he's a really wide kid who's strong on the boards and plays a solid defensive game. There are just no real holes to what he does. And he's another guy who you're like, well, he probably doesn't have any more potential than a 30, 35-point third-line player. But he's another one of those guys who could probably potentially fill in late next year in the NHL. And plus, he's probably one of my favorite interviews ever. So I would always root for Sushko simply because he was such a pleasure to interview. And also a guy from watching him at the World Championships up close. He's the first one off the ice and the last one.
Wow.
I mean,
Yeah,
he's
you're getting me excited.
the first guy on the ice and last one off every single day. Him. He was on the ice until the Zamboni came to clean up during almost every practice I went to watch of theirs. Just shooting pucks at kind of advertising hoardings, trying to hit the O in the middle of an O, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So. Honestly, he sounds like and I got to watch him this year in the AHL. One, I loved his shot. I mean, without a doubt, you said it already. The Albe Kubel comparison, I think, is really fair with a better shot as well. Maybe he's not as big in the lower body. Albe Kubel's legs are like massive, but I totally see what you're saying. He seems like a candidate for a breakout year. I mean, in a sense, for next year, I would say. I mean, he had a really good success in the AHL, I would say, this year. More than I anticipated, especially for a team that was not good. I mean, they should have been better than they were, but they weren't that good. But he was definitely one of the bright spots, offensively especially, which I always get shocked when I see it early from a kid. I don't expect kids to come to the AHL and put up goals. He did it immediately. And he's not like a pure goal scorer guy. So would you say he could be like a breakout guy for next year? Maybe he'd surprise some people?
I think it's going to be difficult with the Phantoms depending on what role you're playing because their forward group is going to be just stacked with prospects. Okay. You know, you've got Cachet, who's there at right wing. You have Allison, who's coming in at right wing. Lashinsky is a centre, but he's also played a lot of right wing. You have Sandin, who's a right wing, even though he can play left wing. It might end up that Sushko, through no fault of his own, is on a third line and will struggle then to hit more than 30 points. But it's not because he's not playing well, it's simply because he's not on the power play. He's not getting those opportunities. But I don't think it would... I think he has the potential to have a fantastic year and once again fly under the radar because he's a good penalty killer. He just does all the little things really nicely. And he was one of the Phantoms who really stood out this year. If I was going to say, of the young Phantoms to me, who when you watch them, you went, okay, he's having a good year despite the team being poor. Obviously, Morgan Frost was number one in that regard. Mark Friedman was the team's best defenseman.
Yep.
While chaos was going on around him, he was generally cleaning things up and being very responsible in his own zone while also playing good offense. And then you had Cachet and Sushko, who also really stood out to me. I mean, Vorobiev was good, but we expect Vorobiev to be good in the AHL. But yeah, Cachet and Sushko were... Maybe their numbers didn't reflect how well they played, but I was really impressed with both of them, partially because of the way they played as well, with the two-way game, with the commitment to defense, with their really good forecheck, and alongside those skills and shots that they have.
Totally, and I think that's what Kasha got a call up this year, right? I mean, he obviously deserved it. He didn't have like monster numbers, but the games were there, right? He even struggled a little bit, but it's when they are able to put it all together, and that's why I kind of look at Sushko because I'm like, okay, well maybe he doesn't start even next year. Maybe you're right? Maybe he starts next year playing third line, fourth line because it's just a numbers game. But all of a sudden, Sandin gets caught up, and then there's some injuries. Like, is he that guy who maybe can kind of grab the opportunity by the horns and kind of take it? I don't know. It's really interesting. I didn't expect him to be as good as he was. So that's why I hear what you're saying on top of that. I'm like, there might be a little bit more, a little bit more earlier than I was expecting because he definitely showed more early than I was expecting. I expected more of like the Carson Torensky route, like the Bunneman, even though Bunneman actually had a great start too, but a little more modest. And I thought he was like maybe 25-30% more successful than I was anticipating. And that's why I got excited about him. Honestly, I know Jamie's very excited about him as well. A lot of people are trying to get excited about players, but you always want to temper your expectations. So let's talk about this, okay? We might have a playoff at some point, right? We have opportunities for black aces. Okay, we have opportunities for young players from that Phantoms. I think the obvious is Morgan Frost, but who are your black aces? I mean, who are you thinking about that as a young player or even a player on the Phantoms, doesn't have to be young, could he come into the NHL and maybe make an impact in the playoffs? I think Farabee obviously falls into that category, but maybe a guy we're not thinking about. Do you have any black aces yourself that you could kind of add to this roster for a playoff run?
I mean, I think it's interesting with what the NHL have said in terms of the rules when it comes to how it's going to be when the playoffs resume, when the playoffs start, should I say, that teams are going to have 28 skaters they can choose and then unlimited goalies. And I think when you start to look at the composition for the Flyers, obviously they've got the 7 defensemen they have right now on the team, plus Friedman, and then they'll probably bring a 9th defenseman in terms of, I mean, Wotherspoon probably, or a Walensky. I would pick Wotherspoon. I think he's a better player than Walensky, but maybe they go Walensky. But then when it comes to forwards, I think it's probably more interesting. Obviously, you have Nolan Patrick. Won't he be able to play? And then you have the obvious guys. I think Morgan Frost is 100% going to be there. And then you start to think there's a lot of different options for who could actually be in that little group. I think Bunneman and Twarynski will 100% be there, along with Morgan Frost, of guys who played most of the season with the Phantoms. And then you start to get to the last few spots, and you're like, well, I would imagine they'd put Andreoff there because he has NHL experience. He played for a long time in the league as an actual legitimate, decent fourth liner. He's a good player. And then you start to get to, the last kind of 2 or 3 spots. And Rubtsov and Kashe, I would say, are probably leading the chase in that regard because they've played this year already. And Vorobyov as well. And I would say, in terms of people who could really step up and make a legitimate impact if people go down, Frost would obviously be the guy for me. But it wouldn't... I mean, I've been a big David Kashe fan for a long time, and I think we saw, in his NHL Cups of Coffee that he has some real skill and can play in that kind of lower role and provide some impact. And he's not going to go out there and score 10 points in the playoffs. But it wouldn't shock me if he kind of came in on the fourth line or as a 13th forward at some point if guys go down. Replace someone like Orbeck Bell and provide a similar or slightly lesser impact than Orbeck Bell. But I think that's what's great about the Flyers right now. You look at the prospects, the guys who are going to be these black aces, and don't feel that bad about plugging any of them into the lineup as a number 12 forward. I don't think Twarynski blew the doors out when he was in the NHL, but he was competent defensively, didn't cause too much trouble. Bunneman, I thought in his second stint was really good, especially for playing centre. And, I think Connor Bunneman can play fourth line centre in the NHL. I was never an enormous fan of his game. I don't think he's got that much upside, but he looked very competent in the NHL as a fourth line centre. And then you get to guys like Vorobyev, who's been a disappointment when he's been in the NHL, but if he gets a chance, he has the skill to potentially succeed. And Rubtsov, Kashe, these guys are all the guys, like, if they're a 13th or 12th forward for a few games, I wouldn't worry too much about them. And I think that's what's nice to have. I don't think anyone apart from Morgan Frost has the potential to make an enormous impact, especially now Orbeck Bell is already going to be cemented in the lineup. So I would say Frost, but after that, I would say I think Kashe is the kind of guy who could really fill in and do a solid job on the fourth line.
Let me ask you, so if German Rubtsov wasn't dealing with the injuries that he dealt with, would you think that he'd be further ahead on that list?
I think so. It's really difficult with Rubtsov. It's been a case of Jekyll and Hyde since he was drafted. He's a guy who I loved in the draft, and I still really like his game. He skates well. He's very much ahead of his years defensively, and always has been. He just sees the game really well, commits to the defensive zone first, and I think at times, quite frankly, it's really rare to say for a prospect, but he takes a bit too much interest in the defensive side of games at times, and puts himself in really low positions in the neutral zone where he can't really contribute to offense. And we saw it in his, draft plus one. He was mediocre in Russia, just okay. Came to the QMJHL and blew the doors off and was one of the best players there through the back end of the season. In his second year in the QMJHL, he was just mediocre, way below what was expected of him. Went to one of the best teams in the league and was just really below average. Like, he was solid defensively and good on the penalty kill, but apart from that, didn't do anything. Last year, before he got injured, he looked like the Phantom's best forward. And then this year, he was okay to start the season, got his call up, and once he went back down to the Phantoms, looked like a different player. And he's dealt with a litany of ridiculous injuries. People talk about players being injury prone, and I think sometimes you have guys who have one or two issues, and you're like, this sucks, but it's going to be detrimental to their careers. With Rubtsov, you look at what's happened since he's been drafted. It's been a broken nose, broken cheekbones, a shoulder on a hip, like an elbow, a wrist, some fingers. Like, it's not one thing. It's also for players. He's had very few muscle issues overall. It's been a lot of random bone breaks, and the shoulder was the big one. Some damage to his shoulder, and he's the kind of guy who I still have faith that he could be a really good middle six forward. I think if I was the Phantoms, I would like to slide him over to wing and tell him, German, use your offensive skill set. We'll have Tanner Lashinsky or Mikhail Vorobyev or Connor Bunneman covering for you at centre. Just go out there and be the offensive catalyst on a line. He can do it. But really, I think next year is a pretty big make or break year for him in terms of, it's not the end of, if he flames out a bit next year and only has a mediocre season, he's still got another year to prove himself. But next year's a really big year, and with all the input of talent into the Phantoms, you want to see Rubtsov be a guy who's a legitimate top six forward for them, a guy who drives the play, a guy who can run the power play for them. Otherwise, you start to think, well, he's probably going to be an NHL player, but is he a fourth liner or a mediocre third liner as opposed to a guy who can potentially be a good middle six player?
Yeah, and I think that's actually pretty fair analysis. I love his game. I think he's so savvy. I think he's a much better playmaker than people realize. But I do agree with you. I don't think he's aggressive enough in the offensive zone. But I think these injuries have just been a killer for him. He's the type of guy where I really saw, if obviously without the injuries, I really saw it as potential call up for now, at the end of this year. Could he be with the Flyers right now? I don't think Connor Bunnaman would have been on the team if German Rubtsov would be a healthy player. Shoulda, woulda, couldas, But I do see him as still that potential guy, and I see a lot of savviness to his game. I do still see a high upside. But you're right. I mean, the Jekyll and Hyde thing is definitely there. And next year is a very important year for him. And as these names start coming on, and we didn't even mention guys like Jay O'Brien, who kind of took a step back. But there's so much talent coming. And it's going to be here. And the Flyers are not stopping to draft and not stopping to bring in young players. And, I worry about a guy like Rubtsov because I don't want to see guys lost in the shuffle, especially if they have a high ceiling. But Rubtsov is always a guy I was excited about. And he's kind of like the one guy I would hope he's healthy enough for the Black Aces because I could see him being a definite impact at the NHL level because he has the physical strength. Somehow getting injured, like you said, all those weird injuries, but he's not weak. He just doesn't get pushed around. He's really strong with the puck. Seems like, maybe some bad luck or what, but I'm really hoping he can turn it back around next year. So, so we're at the end here. We're at the end of the podcast. We're at the hour. We're going to talk about some other stuff, but I think we're good on this one. We had a really good conversation. And honestly, I love a lot of what you said about these prospects. And I think I'm excited about next year in general just because, like you said, the next 5-6 years, we're just getting started here. I want to be the Pittsburgh Penguins. I want the wave and wave after talent. I want the no-name guy that you never heard of that I go out and trade for a second-round pick at the trade deadline. And they're like, who the heck is this guy? I want those stories to come out of the Flyers, and I believe we're on that path. Is there anything that you'd like to see from Chuck Fletcher here at the end? And I don't want to say this season because it's too many question marks, right? We have the draft and everything coming up. Is there anything else that you feel this team is missing that you'd love to see? Maybe the icing on the cake for what could be the next Stanley Cup contender as we move forward?
I mean, it's actually probably the Flyers team with the least holes since
ever.
I mean, maybe 10, 11, 11, 12. They were kind of deep before Mesharos got injured. When they had O'Donnell, he was a solid number 6 defenseman.
Sure.
But when you look at the potential, the only real weaknesses right now when everyone's healthy, maybe you can say that 4C isn't a guaranteed kind of guy, but when Lindblom's healthy and when Patrick's healthy, there's no real holes in the team, and that's what has got them to the point they have this year already. They've got a legitimate 2C in Kevin Hayes. They have James Van Riemsdyk playing third line some nights. When this is a guy who's scored, he's been one of the 15 most productive 5v5 scorers in the NHL over the last 5 years. That depth has really seen them through, so you're not having to rely on Claude Giroux scoring 100 points just to make the playoffs, which, pretty much happened 2 years ago, which you don't have to rely on Shane Gostisbehere having one of the best years for defensemen in recent history and getting 60 points to just make the playoffs. You don't have to have Steve Mason being in Vezina races to make the playoffs and scrape in. And I think the depth that the Flyers have right now is really their strength. In terms of what I'd like to see Fletcher do, I think just keep developing the young talent and trust these guys to come up and play. I think we saw with Farabee this year. Farabee wasn't amazing, but he filled in really well as a third-line NHL player as a 19-year-old. I think we saw with Frost, he came in and did a solid job. And I mean, next year, if Patrick is back for the playoffs, it'll be fantastic to be able to see going forward. Potentially next year, you've got down the middle, Giroux, Hayes, Frost, and Patrick. It would be ridiculous in terms of talent levels versus what we've seen in the past. And I think, see what talent there is available, obviously. I mean, the bringing in Niskanen and Hayes, especially this year, was really big for the Flyers, and they wouldn't be in the position they were. But right now, there just aren't many holes, and apart from continuing letting young players develop and trusting in them.
That's exactly what we've been saying, and I love that, right? It's such a weird feeling, and even just saying that, it's I don't even know what to complain about. I obviously, we can nitpick, I could say, I want a little bit better here, I want a little bit better there, but really for the first time, I in a long time, I feel like we have the framework for a Stanley Cup contender. And I mean, I say that confidently. You know, if you were talking about Zamula, talking about Myers, we're talking about York. I mean, these guys are not even in the NHL, really. I mean, Myers just getting here, it's like these guys are all part of a Stanley Cup recipe, as far as I'm concerned. And they're filling into the other pieces that we have that are rare. And it's a beautiful full thing to see. And I love that you didn't have anything like big to nitpick there, because everybody always says a goal scorer, but goal scoring is a team effort, in my opinion. You know, if you have one guy scoring all your goals, it's probably a problem also. You know, but anyway, love that you came on the podcast. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think the feedback and the information you gave about these prospects, second to none, and just awesome stuff. Thank you again. We'll have you back on, and I wish Jamie could have been here for this one, but we'll get him on the next one with you. And we'll have you back on in the future. And anything you want to leave our audience, tell them where to find you, where to follow you, how to keep track of you, and where to get updates from you, what you got coming up next.
Well, you can follow me at AV Appleyard on Twitter. That's where I probably post most these days. I'm Appleyard on HF boards, but I think probably most people kind of know that right now if they're on HF boards. And then apart from that, contribute at The Athletic. So follow The Athletic. Also read Charlie's work. Charlie O'Connor, worked with him for The Athletic, and just really great Flyers writing on a regular basis, which is, quite frankly, I would always consider myself a man of integrity. And the reason I write for The Athletic is I really believe in the stories they put in out. And I want to read a lot of the stories as a journalist, as a writer. I enjoy reading that stuff. So, that's where you can find me. And,
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you again. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for listening. We'll have more. We'll be back every week. And stay safe, everybody. It's been a crazy summer. But hockey will be back. And we'll be back to the good stuff soon enough. Thank you again, Alex. Thank you, everybody.